I pretended to leave my own home. Then I heard my husband say, "She will never find out." I stood completely still, holding my breath as those words came through the small speaker in my hand. For 40 years, I had believed I knew the man I married. I knew his habits, his favorite coffee, the way he folded the newspaper every morning, and the little things that made him smile. But in that moment, listening from another room, I wondered if I had only known the version of him that he wanted me to see. My name is Margaret Collins. I was 67 years old when I discovered that sometimes the biggest changes in a marriage do not happen during loud arguments. They happen in quiet moments when someone thinks you are no longer paying attention. The day I left was supposed to look ordinary. I packed one small suitcase, placed it near the front door, and told my husband Thomas that I needed a few days away to clear my mind. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse him of anything. I simply told him I needed space. Thomas looked surprised, but not worried. That was the first thing that stayed with me. After nearly 40 years together, I expected him to ask more questions. I expected him to say, "Margaret, what is really wrong?" Instead, he just nodded and said, "Maybe that is best for both of us right now." Those words felt heavier than they should have. But I smiled and walked out. What Thomas did not know was that I had noticed the changes long before that day. Small things. The kind of things people ignore, because admitting them would mean accepting that something might be wrong. His phone was always nearby. Conversations became shorter when I entered the room. Plans about the future were suddenly discussed with other people before they were discussed with me. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. After decades of marriage, I wanted to believe trust was stronger than suspicion. I wanted to believe that the man who had stood beside me through raising our children, paying our mortgage, and building our life together would never hide something important from me. But a quiet feeling kept growing inside me. Not anger, not fear, just a feeling that something was missing from the story I was being told. That afternoon, after I left the house, I drove to my sister's place about 20 minutes away. I did not tell her everything. I simply said Thomas and I needed some time apart. She looked at me carefully, but she did not push. She knew me well enough to understand that when I became quiet, it usually meant I was trying to understand something before speaking. As evening approached, I found myself thinking about the baby monitor we still kept in the guest room. It was an old device we had used years ago when our grandchildren stayed with us. We never bothered removing it because the room was rarely used. That small device had become just another forgotten object in our home. Until that night. I do not know exactly what made me turn it on. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the part of me that had been noticing things for months. I connected to the monitor and watched the quiet room inside our house. At first, there was nothing unusual, just the familiar sounds of home. Then I heard Thomas's voice. I leaned closer. My heart did not race. I did not panic. I simply listened. And then I heard the sentence that changed the way I saw everything. "She will never find out." I stayed there, staring at the screen, trying to understand what I had just heard. Because in that moment I realized something important. Thomas believed I was gone. He believed he could finally speak freely. And that meant the truth was about to reveal itself. I stayed connected to the baby monitor for several minutes after hearing those words. I did not move. I did not call Thomas. I did not send him a message asking what he meant. I simply listened and tried to understand what I was hearing. There is something strange about discovering a truth you have spent years avoiding. A part of you wants to immediately demand answers, but another part of you wants to collect every piece of information before making a decision you cannot take back. That night, I chose to listen. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to see my marriage without the comfort of assumptions. The next few minutes were difficult, not because of what I heard, but because of what I realized. Thomas sounded different when he thought I was not there.
His voice was calm.
Comfortable, like someone discussing a plan that had already been decided. I had spent 40 years believing that important decisions in our family were made together. I believed we were partners. But now I wondered how long I had been standing outside conversations that involved my own life. I eventually turned off the monitor and sat quietly in my sister's guest room. The house was peaceful around me, but my thoughts were moving faster than they had in years. I looked at the small suitcase I had packed earlier that day. Inside were only a few clothes, some personal items, and a book I had been reading. I had left the house thinking I needed a little time to think. I never expected that a simple decision to step away would reveal something I could no longer ignore. The next morning, I woke up early. I made coffee the way I always did, even though I was not in my own kitchen. Some habits become part of who you are. While I sat at the table, I started thinking about the years I had shared with Thomas. I remembered the young man I married, the man who held my hand when we bought our first home, the man who stayed awake with me during difficult nights when our children were young, the man who once told me that honesty was the most important part of any relationship. Those memories were real. That was what made everything so confusing. I was not dealing with a stranger. I was trying to understand a person who had been part of my entire adult life. But over the past few months, I had ignored signs because I wanted to protect the image of the marriage I believed I had. I remembered the small moments that suddenly felt different. Thomas receiving phone calls and walking into another room. Thomas becoming quiet when I asked about future plans. Thomas saying everything was fine when his actions suggested otherwise. At the time, each moment seemed easy to explain. Together, they told a different story. Later that morning, I called my daughter, but I did not tell her what I had heard. I was not ready to bring my family into something I did not fully understand yet. I only asked how her week was going and listened to her talk about everyday things. After the call ended, I realized something important. I was not trying to punish Thomas. I was not looking for revenge. I was trying to protect myself from making a decision based only on emotion. I needed the truth. And if Thomas had been keeping something from me, I needed to understand exactly what it was before I confronted him. That afternoon, I returned home while Thomas was away running errands. I walked through the room slowly, noticing details I had passed by thousands of times. The family photos, the dining table, the small decorations we collected during vacations. Everything looked the same, but I felt different. I was no longer walking through my home as someone who assumed she knew everything. I was walking through it as someone who had finally started paying attention. And deep inside, I knew this was only the beginning. When I walked back into my house that afternoon, everything looked exactly the same. The clock on the wall was still ticking. The flowers on the dining table were still arranged the way I had placed them that morning. The family pictures were still hanging in the same places. But I knew something had changed. It was not the house. It was me. For years, I had looked at those rooms and only remembered the good moments. The celebrations. The laughter. The years we spent building a life together. But now I was looking more carefully. I was noticing the spaces between those memories. The moments I had dismissed because I wanted to believe everything was fine. I started with the small things. The things that had bothered me but never seemed important enough to mention. Thomas had become protective of his schedule. He started making plans without explaining them. He would say things like, "I have something to handle," or "It is just family business," and I would accept those answers because I trusted him. I never wanted to be the person who questioned everything. I believed marriage was built on giving each other the benefit of the doubt. But there is a difference between trust and ignoring what is right in front of you. That evening, I walked into our bedroom and opened the drawer where we kept important documents. I was not looking for anything specific. I only wanted to understand whether my concerns had a foundation or whether I was simply letting my imagination run too far. Inside, I found old paperwork from our years together. Mortgage statements, insurance records, notes from when we renovated parts of the house. Each document reminded me of the life we had created. Then I noticed something that made me stop. There were recent papers missing from the folder where we usually kept everything. I sat there quietly, holding the empty space where those documents should have been. It was such a small detail, but sometimes small details are the ones that tell you the most. The next morning, I called Daniel Hayes. He had helped our family with legal matters years earlier, and I trusted his honesty. I did not tell him everything over the phone. I simply said I needed advice about some documents and wanted to understand my situation clearly. When I arrived at his office, he looked at me with concern. "Margaret, are you sure everything is okay?" he asked. I thought about giving him the easy answer. The answer I had given people for years. Yes, everything is fine. But for the first time in a long time, I decided not to pretend. "I am not sure anymore," I said. Daniel listened carefully as I explained what had happened. I told him about leaving the house. I told him about the baby monitor. I told him about the words I heard. I did not exaggerate. I did not make accusations. I simply shared the facts. After a few moments of silence, Daniel said something I will never forget. "Margaret, sometimes the hardest part is not discovering that someone changed. It is realizing how long you ignored the signs because you wanted to believe they had not." Those words stayed with me. He began reviewing the information I brought him and asked questions I had never thought to ask. Questions about decisions. Questions about conversations. Questions about things Thomas had never discussed with me. I answered as honestly as I could. By the time I left his office, I did not have every answer, but I had something I had not felt in weeks. Direction. I knew I could not rush. I knew I could not confront Thomas based only on emotion. The truth was bigger than one conversation. It was connected to years of choices, and I needed to understand all of it. That evening, when Thomas came home, he looked at me and smiled like everything was normal. I smiled back. But inside, I was different. I was no longer waiting for the truth to find me. I had started looking for it myself. The days after my conversation with Daniel felt different. Not because Thomas knew anything had changed, but because I no longer saw our daily routine the same way. Before, I moved through my life with complete trust. I believed that the person beside me was always moving in the same direction. Now, I found myself paying attention to the moments I once overlooked. I watched how Thomas answered questions. I noticed when his words did not match his actions. I listened more carefully, not because I wanted to find reasons to doubt him, but because I finally understood that I needed to know the truth. For years, I had been the person who kept our family connected. I remembered birthdays, planned holiday gatherings, checked on relatives, and made sure everyone felt included. That was simply who I was. I never considered those things sacrifices because I loved my family. But as I looked back, I realized something important. I had spent so much time making sure everyone else felt secure that I never stopped to ask whether I felt secure myself. One afternoon, I found an old box in the closet filled with memories from the early years of our marriage. Inside were photographs, handwritten notes, and small reminders of the life Thomas and I created together. I sat on the floor and looked through everything slowly. There was a picture of us standing in front of our first house. We looked younger, full of excitement and hope. There was another picture from the day we celebrated paying off our mortgage. Thomas had his arm around me, and we were both smiling because we believed we had reached a milestone together. Those memories were real. That was the hardest part. I was not dealing with a marriage that had always been unhappy. I was trying to understand how something that once felt so strong could become something I no longer recognized. Later that evening, Thomas came into the room and noticed the box beside me. "Looking through old memories?" he asked with a small smile. I looked up at him and said, "Yes. I found things I had forgotten about." He nodded and sat down beside me. For a moment, everything felt familiar again. The kind of moment that made me question whether I was making too much of what I heard. Then he said something simple. "Sometimes people hold onto the past too much." I looked at him. "What do you mean?" He paused before answering. "I just mean that life changes. We have to make decisions based on what comes next." It was not a shocking statement. It was not something that would make anyone else suspicious. But after everything I had discovered, those words felt different. What comes next? I wondered who he imagined standing beside him in that future. The next morning, I met Daniel again. He had reviewed the information I provided and wanted to discuss what he found. He explained that some conversations and decisions involving our family had been happening without my knowledge. He was careful with his words. He did not make assumptions. He simply helped me understand the situation clearly. "Margaret," he said, "you do not need to rush into anything. But you do need to make sure you understand what is happening around you." I appreciated that advice because I was not looking for a fight. I was not trying to destroy the life I had built. I only wanted honesty. When I returned home, I saw Thomas preparing dinner in the kitchen.
It was such an ordinary scene.
The kind of scene we had repeated thousands of times. But I realized something. Ordinary moments can hide extraordinary truths. The person standing in front of me was still the man I had shared my life with. But now I knew there were parts of his world I had not been invited into. And instead of ignoring that feeling, I decided to trust myself. I would not rush. I would not react. I would simply keep listening, keep learning, and wait until I understood the entire truth. The following week, I began to notice that Thomas was becoming more
comfortable again.
He seemed to believe that whatever was happening behind the scenes was still hidden from me. He returned to his usual routines. He made coffee in the morning, read the newspaper at the kitchen table, and talked about ordinary things as if our lives had not changed. But I had changed. I was no longer looking at those moments the same way. I was paying attention. Not because I wanted to catch him doing something wrong, but because I had finally accepted that there were questions I needed answered. One morning, while Thomas was outside working in the yard, I went through the documents Daniel had helped me organize. I carefully reviewed everything again. There was something about seeing the information together that made the situation clearer. Separately, each detail seemed small. Together, they showed a pattern. Conversations that happened without me. Decisions that were discussed before I was included. Plans that involved my future, but never included my voice. I sat at my desk and thought about how strange it felt to be learning about my own life from pieces of information instead of from the person I shared it with. That was the part that hurt the most. Not the possibility of change. Not even the uncertainty. It was the feeling that I had been standing beside someone while they were quietly building a separate path. Later that day, I received a call from Daniel. He asked if I could come by his office because he had found additional information. When I arrived, he placed a folder in front of me. "Margaret, I want you to remember something," he said. "You do not have to make any decisions today. The important thing is that you understand your situation completely." I appreciated his calm approach. He never encouraged anger. He never told me what I should feel. He simply gave me the information and allowed me to think. Inside the folder were details about conversations Thomas had been having regarding future arrangements. Nothing had been finalized, but enough had happened for me to understand that I could no longer pretend everything was normal. I looked at Daniel and asked, "Did Thomas ever mention any of this to you directly?" Daniel shook his head.
No.
"That is part of why I think you need to be careful. You should not assume people will always tell you what you need to know." On the drive home, I thought about that sentence. You should not assume people will always tell you what you need to know. For most of my life, I had believed honesty was automatic between people who loved each other. I believed that after 40 years of marriage, there were certain things that did not need to be questioned. But I was learning that trust does not mean ignoring reality. That evening, Thomas asked me why I seemed so quiet. I looked at him and smiled gently. I have just been thinking about a lot of things. He studied my face for a moment. About us, he asked. I paused before answering.
About life.
About choices. About what people decide when they think no one is watching. For a second, I saw something change in his expression. It was small, almost impossible to notice. But I noticed it. He quickly looked away and changed the subject. Before, I might have ignored that moment. I might have convinced myself it meant nothing. But now I understood the importance of paying attention. That night, after Thomas went to bed, I sat alone in the living room. I looked around at the home we had created together. I remembered every year, every celebration, every difficult season we survived. I did not want to believe that our entire marriage was a lie. I still respected the memories we shared, but I also knew that memories could not answer the questions I had today. The truth could, and I was determined to find it without losing the person I had spent my whole life becoming. The days that followed were filled with a strange kind of silence. Not the peaceful silence I had known for years, but the kind that makes you notice every small sound around you. The ticking clock in the hallway. The sound of Thomas moving through the kitchen in the morning. The quiet moments when he thought I was not paying attention. I continued living my normal routine because I did not want him to know that anything had changed. I made breakfast. I watered the plants. I answered his questions with the same calm voice I had always used.
But
inside, I was collecting pieces of a truth I was not ready to fully accept. I had learned something important about human behavior. When people believe they have control of a situation, they often stop being careful. They become comfortable. They reveal more than they realize. Thomas was no different. He started making small comments that seemed harmless, but each one added another piece to the picture I was trying to understand. One evening, while we were sitting in the living room, he mentioned that some things in life needed to be handled practically. I looked at him and asked what he meant. He quickly changed the subject and started talking about the weather. Before, I would have let it go. I would have told myself that he was simply tired or distracted. But now I recognized those moments for what they were. They were openings. Small windows into conversations he did not want to have. A few days later, I met Daniel again. This time, I brought everything I had collected. I brought notes. I brought dates. I brought copies of documents that seemed unusual. Daniel reviewed everything carefully while I sat across from him. He did not rush. He understood that this was not just about paperwork. This was about a woman trying to understand a major change in the life she had spent decades building. After several minutes, he looked at me and said, "Margaret, I think you already know the most important part. You have been left out of conversations that directly affect you." I looked down at the folder in front of me. Those words were difficult because they were simple. There was no complicated explanation. No misunderstanding to hide behind. I had been excluded, and that realization changed something inside me. For years, I had believed that keeping peace meant avoiding uncomfortable conversations. I thought love meant trusting without question. But I was beginning to understand that respect required honesty from both people. Daniel suggested that I take time before speaking with Thomas. "Do not approach him because you are hurt," he told me. "Approach him when you are clear about what you need." I appreciated that advice. I did not want to have a conversation where emotions controlled my words. I wanted to be calm enough to hear the truth, even if it was difficult. That evening, I returned home and found Thomas sitting at the dining table looking through his phone. When he saw me, he quickly placed it face down.
It was a small movement.
A movement that might have meant nothing months earlier. But now, after everything I had learned, it caught my attention. He smiled and asked, "How was your day?" I smiled back. It was good. He continued talking about ordinary things, unaware that I was seeing the situation differently. Later that night, I walked into the guest room where the baby monitor was kept. I looked at the small device sitting on the shelf. A few weeks earlier, it had simply been an old item we never bothered to remove. Now it represented the moment when my understanding of my marriage changed forever. I did not feel anger when I looked at it. I felt clarity. That device did not create the problem. It only revealed what was already there. I knew the next step would be difficult. I knew eventually I would have to sit across from Thomas and ask questions he could no longer avoid. But I also knew something else. I was not walking into that conversation as the confused woman who left the house looking for answers. I was walking into it as a woman who had taken the time to understand the truth. And that made all the difference. The morning I decided to talk to Thomas, I woke up earlier than usual. I sat quietly at the kitchen table with my coffee and watched the sunlight move across the room. It was the same kitchen where we had shared thousands of mornings together. The same table where we planned vacations, discussed family matters, and made decisions about our future. For decades, this room represented comfort and trust. But now, I was sitting there preparing for a conversation I never thought I would have. I was not nervous because I was afraid of Thomas. I was nervous because I knew that once certain words were spoken, things could never return to the way they were before. Some conversations change the direction of your life. They are not loud or dramatic. They are simply moments when you finally stop avoiding the truth. Thomas came into the kitchen and immediately noticed that something was different. He looked at me and asked, "Is everything okay?" I looked at him for a moment before answering. "I think we need to talk." Those words seemed to surprise him. He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. "About what?" he asked. I took a deep breath and placed my hands together on the table. "About the things that have been happening without my knowledge." For a moment, he did not respond. His expression changed slightly, but he quickly tried to hide it. "Margaret, I do not know what you mean." I expected that answer. I was prepared for him to avoid the conversation.
So I stayed calm.
"I mean the decisions that involve our future. The conversations that happened without me. The things you believed I would never discover." Thomas looked away. That small movement told me more than words could. For years, I had known every expression on his face. I knew when he was happy, when he was frustrated, and when he was trying to avoid a difficult topic. This was one of those moments. "You were never supposed to find out this way," he finally said. I listened carefully. Those words were not a denial. They were an admission that there was something I did not know. Then how was I supposed to find out? I asked. Thomas stayed quiet. The silence between us felt longer than it really was. I thought about all the years we had spent together, all the challenges we had overcome, all the moments when I stood beside him without hesitation. I was not asking for perfection. I was asking for honesty. "Thomas," I said softly, "what hurts is not only what you did. It is that you decided I did not deserve to be part of the conversation." He looked down at the table. For the first time in a long time, I saw uncertainty on his face. He began explaining his reasons. He talked about wanting to make things easier. He talked about concerns he had. He talked about decisions he believed were practical. But as I listened, I realized something important. Even if he believed he was making the right choice, he had still chosen to leave me out. That was the part one could not ignore. I did not interrupt him. I let him finish. When he was done, I simply said, I spent my entire life building this family with you. I never expected to be the last person to know what was happening inside it. Thomas looked at me quietly. I could tell he wanted to explain more, but some explanations arrived too late. After our conversation ended, I walked outside into the backyard. The same yard where we planted flowers, celebrated birthdays, and watched our children grow. I stood there for a few minutes and felt something unexpected. I was sad, but I was also peaceful, because for the first time, I was no longer waiting for someone else to give me the truth. I had faced it myself, and that gave me a strength I had not felt in years. After my conversation with Thomas, I expected to feel more upset than I did. I thought hearing his explanation would bring back the pain I had been carrying for weeks. Instead, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. I felt certain, not because everything was fixed, and not because the answers were easy to accept. I felt certain because I finally stopped questioning my own instincts. For so long, I had wondered if I was imagining things. I wondered if I was being too sensitive or looking too deeply into ordinary situations. But now I understood that my concerns were not created by fear. They came from noticing changes that had been happening right in front of me. The hardest part was realizing that Thomas had not seen me as someone who needed to be included. He had seen me as someone who would eventually accept whatever decision was made. That realization stayed with me. The next few days were quiet between us. Not the uncomfortable silence from the beginning, but a different kind of silence. We were both thinking. We were both processing what had been said. Thomas continued his normal routine, but I noticed a difference in him. He seemed less certain. The confidence he once carried was gone. He no longer acted like the future was already decided. One evening, he came into the living room while I was looking through old family photographs. He stood there for a moment before speaking. "You really think I was trying to leave you out?" he asked. I looked up at him. "I think you made choices without giving me the chance to be part of them." He sat down slowly. "I thought I was handling things." I nodded. "Maybe you thought that. But handling something alone does not mean you are protecting someone. Sometimes it means you are taking away their choice." He did not answer immediately. I could tell those words reached him because they were not spoken with anger. They were simply the truth. During those days, I also spent time thinking about what I wanted moving forward. For years, I had measured happiness by how peaceful the family was. If everyone else was comfortable, I believed I was doing my job. But I began asking myself a different question. Was I truly creating peace, or was I simply avoiding conflict by ignoring my own needs? That question changed everything. I realized that protecting a relationship did not mean allowing myself to disappear inside it. A marriage required two people, two voices, two people willing to respect each other. Later that week, I met Daniel one more time. I told him about my conversation with Thomas. Daniel listened carefully and then said, "Margaret, the important thing is that you are making decisions from a place of understanding, not fear." I appreciated that. He reminded me that I did not have to decide everything immediately. I could take my time. I could think about what kind of future I wanted. When I returned home that afternoon, I stood in the hallway and looked around the house. For many years, I had seen it only as the place where our family memories lived. Now I saw something else too. I saw my own strength. I saw the years of effort I had given. I saw the person I had become. The house had never been just walls and furniture. It represented my life, my choices, and the many years I had spent caring for the people I loved. That evening, Thomas and I sat together at the dinner table. The conversation was not perfect. There were still things we needed to discuss. There were still feelings we needed to understand. But for the first time in a long while, we were speaking honestly. And that mattered. I knew the journey was not over. The truth had been revealed. But rebuilding trust would take time. Still, I felt something I had almost forgotten. I felt like I had a voice again. And this time, I was determined not to lose it. In the weeks that followed, I learned that rebuilding trust was not about forgetting what happened. It was about understanding what happened and deciding what I wanted my life to look like moving forward. For the first time in many years, I stopped measuring my choices by how they affected everyone else. I started asking myself what I needed. That was not something I was used to doing. As a wife, a mother, and a grandmother, I had spent most of my life thinking about the comfort of others before my own. But I was beginning to understand that caring for myself did not mean I cared about my family any less. It meant I was finally recognizing that my feelings mattered too. Thomas and I continued having conversations. Some were easy, some were difficult. There were moments when we sat across from each other at the kitchen table and struggled to find the right words. 40 years together creates a lot of memories, but it also creates a lot of things left unsaid. We had spent years talking about schedules, bills, family plans, and daily responsibilities. But we had not always talked about the deeper things. The fears, the expectations, the moments when one person felt alone while the other believed everything was fine. One evening, Thomas sat beside me in the living room and looked through some of our old photographs. He held one picture for a long time. It was from the early years of our marriage, when we had just moved into our home. "I remember how excited we were," he said quietly. I looked at the photograph and smiled. "We worked hard for that life." He nodded. "Yes, we did." There was a sadness in his voice that I had not heard before. Not because I wanted him to feel guilty, but because I think he was finally understanding what I had been trying to explain. Our home was not just an asset or a place to make arrangements around. It was a record of everything we had built together. I told him something I had been thinking about for a long time. "Thomas, what hurt me most was not that you had concerns, or that you wanted to make plans. What hurt me was believing that I was no longer someone you needed beside you." He looked at me and said, "I did not realize how much I was shutting you out." That sentence meant more than a perfect apology would have. Because sometimes people do not need to say the exact words you hope to hear. Sometimes they need to finally understand the impact of their actions. Over time, our relationship changed. Not overnight. Not magically. Trust does not return because of one conversation. It returns through small choices made consistently. Through honesty. Through listening. Through remembering that two people in a marriage both deserve a voice. I also changed the way I looked at myself. I became more confident in making decisions. I became more willing to speak when something bothered me. I stopped apologizing for asking questions. I stopped believing that keeping peace meant staying silent. The baby monitor that had revealed a painful truth eventually became just another object in the house. But I never forgot what that moment represented. It reminded me that sometimes life gives you the answers you were afraid to seek. It showed me that my instincts deserved to be trusted. Looking back now, I do not think that moment was only about discovering what Thomas had said. It was about discovering something about myself. I discovered that after 40 years of caring for everyone else, I still had the ability to stand up for my own happiness. I discovered that age does not mean losing your voice. It does not mean accepting whatever happens around you. It does not mean your needs become less important. Today, when I walk through the same rooms where so many memories were created, I see them differently. I see the life I built. I see the lessons I learned. And most importantly, I see myself clearly. Because sometimes the greatest change does not come from leaving everything behind. Sometimes it comes from finally recognizing your own worth and choosing to move forward with dignity.